Welcome to Unit 1. This is an introduction to physical science, and we start this unit with a lesson about how to be safe in the lab. We're going to be doing lots of lab experiments this year, and we need to know what's expected of us inside the lab because the rules in the lab are going to be a little bit different than the rules in the classroom. So we're going to start this lesson specifically looking at lab safety symbols. We're going to go through 8 symbols that you might see this year as we do a lab. And then if you see that symbol posted on a lab sheet, or if your teacher gives you the symbol prior to the lab, you need to know what it means and what you're going to be working with. So the first symbol that we're going to start with is this Erlenmeyer flask symbol. This is our glassware safety symbol, and obviously it means you're going to be working with glassware. So this could be a beaker, it could be a thermometer, it could be an Erlenmeyer flask, it could be a graduated cylinder or a glass stir rod, but somewhere in the lab you're going to have some sort of glassware, and there's a couple rules that you need to make sure that you follow if we're using glassware. So the first thing I want you to get used to is when we're in the lab, you get to your lab station, always check your glassware to make sure that it's not chipped or cracked or broken. You don't want to ever use broken glassware. So get in the habit of checking over your glassware and let your teacher know if something looks cracked or chipped or broken. Another thing that we want to do if we're working with the glassware is we never want to heat glassware that isn't thoroughly dried. So let me give you an example of when this might come into play. Let's say you are in a second period science class, and first period used the lab equipment prior to you, and they washed their equipment and they put it up. And they forgot to dry it. So you get to your station, you have a wet beaker. The rules on your lab sheet say you need to heat a beaker of water. So you just put wet glassware on an electronic hot plate and you crank that heat up to high. What might happen, I don't know if you've ever dealt with this at home, but when you put wet glassware on a hot eye, that's not thoroughly dried, it might slide. So if you have one of those cooktop stoves at home that are flat, this happens a lot to me. You may have seen it as well. You have like a pan or a pot you put on that's still kind of wet, you put it on the eye and it slides. That could be really dangerous in the science classroom. So we want to make sure that any glassware that we're going to heat has been thoroughly dried before we put it on the hot plate or under the flame of our Bunsen burner. Another thing that we want to make sure that we do when we're working with glassware is if we have hot glassware, we want to make sure that we pick up that glassware with something that's going to be protective. So that could be heat resistant gloves, that could also be tongs or a test tube clamp. So there's different tools that we're going to use with hot glassware, but we never want to pick up hot glassware with our bare hands. Also, when you're working with glassware at the end of the lab, you want to make sure that you always clean and dry your glassware thoroughly before you put it away or before you leave for the day. However, one thing that we need to make sure that we don't do is you never want to take hot glass and run it under cold water. That's going to shatter the glass every time. Probably the most broken beakers and flasks that I have in the year are from students who take something hot off the hot plate, and then when it's time for cleanup, they run that hot glassware under cold water. You either want to rinse it off with warm water, or you want to let that glassware come to room temperature or pretty close to room temperature before you clean it. Also, something that we need to make sure that we do when we're working with glassware, and this goes for any glassware, is we want to make sure we wear safety goggles to protect our eyes, because a lot of things can happen when you're using glass in the science lab, and we want to make sure our eyes are protected. Now, these two symbols are two different symbols. They mean two different things, but I have them on the same slide because sometimes they are mixed up. and I want to make sure that we note the difference between the two. So the flame symbol is actually exactly what it means. It means we're going to be working with an open flame. So it's your fire safety symbol. Now, the hot mitt symbol is known as the heat safety symbol. So you might question and say, wouldn't they mean the same thing? Well, let me give you an example of when you would use one and not the other. So, of course, anytime you're going to have an open flame, that flame is going to be hot. So you're going to see the open flame symbol paired with the hot mitt symbol or the heat safety symbol every time. However, just because we're working with something hot doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to have an open flame. So let's say your lab instructions say to heat a glass beaker of water to 100 degrees Celsius, and we're going to use a hot plate to do that. So a hot plate uses electricity. It doesn't use an open flame. So in that case, you would see the heat safety symbol because we're going to be working with heat, but you would not see the fire safety symbol or the open flame symbol because we're not working with the open flame, or we hope not to be working with the open flame. So these are sometimes used together, but sometimes used separate. So if you're using fire or any hot piece of equipment, or sometimes chemical reactions will produce heat. So you'll see the heat safety symbol there when we have chemical reaction labs where we mix two things together and we get a chemical reaction that produces heat. So a couple things to note. You want to use safety goggles always when you see these two symbols. So remember, when you see the glassware safety symbol, that means you've got to wear safety goggles in the lab. But when you see the fire safety symbol or the heat safety symbol, goggles are required as well too. We never want to heat anything unless we're told to do so. So unless your instructions specifically tell you to heat, you would need to not heat up anything. Unless you have specific instructions. Never heat anything with a closed container. That builds pressure. That could become a problem. You could really get hurt. So just make sure that you don't have a closed container when you're heating substances. If we're using the Bunsen burner and we have an open flame, or if we're using the candles or tea lights, of course, those produce open flame. We never want to reach across those. Also, you're going to want to use some sort of protection, just like with the glassware safety symbol, some sort of protection when you're having to handle hot objects. So in physical science, a lot of our labs have us heating something or producing chemical reactions that produce heat, and we're going to want to protect our hands. So clamps, tongs, heat-resistant gloves, those are all pieces of equipment that we might use. You want to make sure that when you're working with heat or fire that you have a clean work area. We don't want papers or books or anything like that on our lab station. And then you just need to know the location of your fire extinguisher and fire blanket. And most science classrooms have those available, and you need to make sure that you know where those are located. Now, the skull and crossbones symbol is often used in real life to depict something that's poisonous, but in the science lab, it's going to be used to depict a chemical. It doesn't necessarily mean that that chemical is poisonous, but it does mean that we need to treat it as if it's poisonous. So a couple things to remember when you see the skull and crossbone chemical safety symbol. Never smell chemicals directly. You always want to waft, and the way that works is you just kind of waft your hand over the fumes towards your nose. And there are certain times, I know when we talk about chemical changes, some chemical changes produced an odor or smell. And so your teacher might say waft to see if you notice any sort of change in smell. But never smell chemicals directly. You never want to mix chemicals unless your instructions tell you to do so or your teacher has told you to do so. You never want to touch or taste chemicals unless instructed to do so. And I can't think of any time in physical science where you'll be asked to taste chemicals. So just bear in mind, you don't want to, cross-contamination happens a lot. So even if we're working with something like cornstarch, You don't want to, even if you like cornstarch, you don't want to taste it in the science lab because a spoon could have been used to pick up something like sodium hydroxide and then it stuck in the cornstarch box, and that's cross-contamination, and you just want to stay clear of tasting any chemicals. Make sure that when you're using chemicals, all the lids and tops are on them when they're not in use. We don't want to spill anything and have any accidents. Make sure that you always dispose of chemicals as instructed by your teacher. We don't throw away anything in the trash or rinse anything down the drain unless the teacher has told us to do so. A lot of the chemicals will corrode the pipes in our school, and so we want to make sure that we dispose of chemicals the way that we're supposed to. If you happen to get a chemical in your eye or on your skin or clothes, make sure you notify your teacher right away. There are certain steps and procedures that teachers have to follow if something happens to you in the lab. That protects your teacher, that protects you. So make sure you notify your teacher if you get any chemicals on your skin, clothes, or in your eyes. And your teacher will very likely tell you if you get chemicals in your eyes to go rinse with water immediately. So just keep that in mind. You'll want to know where your nearest eye wash station is. And in the event that you have a big chemical spill, where the location of your overhead shower is. Now, when you see this symbol, this is our eye and face safety symbol, and it means we need to protect our eyes. So we're going to see this symbol in conjunction with our glassware safety symbol. We're also going to see this symbol when we're using fire or heat, and sometimes it's just used as a standalone precaution. So it means you got to wear safety goggles. And just a reminder, we've already mentioned this, but anytime you're heating something like a test tube or a bottle or something, you want to make sure that you point it away from yourself, away from others, so that we don't have any pressure build up and something pop off the end and hit somebody in the eye. All right, so when you see this symbol, this means we're going to be working with sharp instruments. There are not very many times in physical science where we use sharp objects, but occasionally your teacher might feel as though this is something that needs to show up on the lab sheet. So if you get this symbol, you need to know that something's going to be sharp, and you need to make sure you handle sharp objects with care. Don't throw scissors or scalpels across the room. Make sure if you have to cut something, you always cut away from you and away from others. And if for some reason your skin gets cut in the lab, whether it be by a piece of glass or even a paper cut, you need to notify your teacher. When you see the outlet plug symbol, this is electrical safety. This means we're going to be working with electricity, and there's a couple things you need to note. One, electricity and water do not mix. So you want to make sure you keep the two separate. You don't want to plug in more than 2 appliances at any one outlet. And you want to make sure that if you have to unplug or plug in an electrical appliance, that you do so with dry hands. In the event that you see the animal safety symbol, there's a couple things that you need to note. And again, physical science, there will not be many times where we dissect or have animals in the classroom, but if you have a class pet, this goes for that situation, or if there's any sort of specimen that we're looking at in physical science, these rules apply. So do not cause any pain or injury to any animal. This goes for live animals and specimens. So an animal that has been preserved, and then we're looking at it for some sort of science purpose. Make sure that you don't perform inhumane stunts or actions with any animal specimen. And make sure if you handle any animal, that specimen or live, that you make sure that you wash your hands thoroughly when you get finished. All right, so just a quick check. I'm going to go through each of the 8 symbols that we talked about, and you kind of think to yourself, what does this symbol mean? So what does this symbol stand for? All right, so this is our eye safety symbol. Remember, that means to wear goggles and protect our eyes. What about this one? If you said animal safety, that's correct. This is our electrical safety symbol. It means we're going to be working with something that runs off of electricity, and we just need to be very careful. Now, this symbol looks a little different in the here than it did in the slideshow. I just wanted to show you that sometimes you see the sharp instrument safety symbol this way instead of like the finger prick symbol that we saw earlier. And it just means that you're going to be working with something sharp and you need to take precautions. All right, this is our heat safety symbol. Remember, this is not the same as the open flame or fire safety symbol. This means that we're going to be working with something that produces heat. This is our chemical safety symbol. Remember, we treat everything as if it's a chemical in the science lab, even if it's not directly poisonous, because it could be in the science lab. This is our glassware safety symbol. Remember, this is anytime, we're going to see this anytime we're working with glassware. We've got to wear goggles when we're working with glassware, and we just need to make sure that we inspect our glassware before we use it to make sure that it's not chipped or cracked or broken. All right, really quick, I want you to jot down on a piece of paper the numbers 1 through 8, and I want you to match the safety term to the picture of the safety symbol. Pause the video now. All right, so for number 1, fire safety, you should have chose H. Number 2, glassware safety, that was A. Number 3, chemical safety, that's going to be D. Number 4, heat safety, that is B. Number 5, electrical safety, G. Number 6, eye safety, that is E. Number 7, animal safety, that is F. Number 8, sharp instrument safety, that is C.